Keir Starmer's premiership looks slightly, very slightly more secure for now. But that doesn't mean certain leadership contenders aren't on manoeuvres, setting up their paths to power but biding their time. Last night, Health Secretary Wes Streeting made his first move towards a Downing Street campaign, describing reports of his long friendship with Peter Mandelson as, quote, smears, and declaring himself to have a true understanding of the lessons the government needs to learn. Streeting gains the advantage of being the first to break ranks, and he gains a second advantage by appearing to exercise the kind of transparency so far lacking with Keir Starmer. That's because also last night, Streeting made the text messages and WhatsApp conversations he's had with Mandelson over the past 14 months public. Now, those messages aren't especially revealing, though their publication serves a dual purpose for Streeting. Assuming they're all the messages, they don't show any untoward communications with Mandelson, at least by electronic message. But some of their content is both embarrassing to Starmer's government while separating Streeting from the status quo. Like this exchange from March 2025, beginning with a discussion of Matthew Doyle, at that time the Downing Street Director of Communications, who left the job around that time. Wes Streeting, you should get Doyle to do your comms in DC. Okay, this is something you should tell somebody about getting somebody to do their comms, but I'm not that close to them, Gov. I mean, you kind of would be to be on those kinds of terms, no? Lord Mandelson, all my comms have been shut down by number 10. Why was he pushed out? Wes Streeting, God knows. The government problems do not stem from comms. Just quickly on this chat, before we go to the rest of these messages, Matthew Doyle has now been elevated to the House of Lords. He's attracted a lot of criticism because he was campaigning for a Labour councillor to be re-elected in 2017 who had actually already been charged with possession of images of children, found guilty of possession of sexual images of children, including a girl as young as 10. He'd been charged with that. Doyle was campaigning for him. There is a pattern here, guys. I don't mean to sound all Alex Jones and QAnon. There is a pattern that clearly very senior people in the Labour Party do not care about child sexual exploitation. I don't mean to sound, I'm not trying, it's not clickbait. If that happened, if somebody in Novara media was campaigning for somebody who'd been charged with that kind of offence, and then they were saying, can you give me a really serious job like being a legislator for life, which is what the House of Lords is, you'd probably say, look, come back in 10 years. I don't think your judgment's very good. It doesn't warrant that kind of position. That would be what I think anyway. I think that's pretty normal. Let's go on with that exchange. Wes Streeting, quite. I fear we're in big trouble here. And I'm toast at the next election. We just lost our safest ward in Redbridge, 51% Muslim, Ilford South, to a Gaza independent. Constituencies are comprised of various electoral wards. At this rate, I don't think we'll hold either of the two Ilford seats. There isn't a clear answer to the question. Why Labour? Lord Mandelson, the government doesn't have an economic philosophy which is then followed through in a programme of policies. Wes Streeting, no growth strategy at all. Another exchange saw Streeting criticise the government over Gaza in late July last year. Wes Streeting, I'm sure this will come up in coming days, so wanted to check in with you on recognition of Palestine and the domestic politics of it. Keir's statement today was excellent, but Macron's statement tonight ups the ante. Morally and politically, I think we need to join France. Morally, because Israel is committing war crimes before our eyes, their government talks the language of ethnic cleansing, and I've met with our own medics out there who describe the most chilling and distressing scenes of calculated brutality against women and children. Politically, a Commons vote will be engineered in September on recognition, and we will lose it if we're not ahead of it. There are no circumstances in which people like me or Shabana Mahmood, who is a Birmingham MP, could abstain or vote against, for example. Conference will be a sea of Palestinian flags and the moderates will be waving them. We need to be leading the charge on this. The alternative is being dragged there with enormous damage to Keir, the government and the party. I've never been a shrinking violet on Israel. I've supported LFI, Labour Friends of Israel, for over 20 years. Our sister party, Haaretz, and progressives are clear about what's being done in their name and they oppose it. Our sister party, as in the Israeli Labour Party, Haaretz being the paper of record in Israel, but also a centre-left newspaper. I appreciate these things are always more complicated than they appear to those of us who aren't up close as you are. And I also appreciate how much Keir and David are giving to this personally. That's David Lammy. But it is what it is. We need to lead, not follow. This is Lord Mandelson in response to quite extraordinary claims made by Streeting. I can see all this, but I am worried that such a gesture, because apparently recognizing Palestine is just a gesture, could blow a two-state solution out of the water. I think he says 2SS, doesn't he? If Israel decided that unilateral recognition justified further West Bank annexation, which the US would be powerless to stop or reverse. Apparently the US would be powerless to stop. Literally just stop sending them money. Anyway, that would be the end of it. So I think we need to employ practical means to get a two-state solution. Not quickly, I grant, but realistically. The Palestinian Authority, with reform and new leadership, can advance this with Arab, US, European support. The alternative is a further deadlocked death spiral on an even greater scale than now. We're streeting. Israel is doing it anyway. Wes Streeting goes on to say, this is rogue state behavior. Let them pay the price as pariahs with sanctions applied to the state, not just a few ministers. Extraordinary. One of the most high prominent supporters of Israel within the Labour cabinet saying, apply sanctions to Israel. If I say that on TV, I get called an anti-Semite. I have been. Lord Mandelson, well, I don't make government policy. I can only help implement it. So my views are between us. We're streeting, absolutely. Not shooting the messenger. It's very helpful in trying to understand what Kira's weighing up as he balances all the risks and considerations that aren't necessarily obvious to the rest of us. So thank you. That conversation continued the following day. How are you feeling now? So they're talking over multiple days. How are you feeling? I mean, again, this is what friends do. We're streeting, extremely concerned. Keir's statement has been received as boxing himself in. We are headed straight into a summer of angst. SO24 debate and engineered vote on recognition in September. If whipped resignations at every level, as in, I suppose, government, right? Cabinet, but also, would people leave the Labour Party? I mean, I have no idea. I presume at every level, that's what he means. Resignations at every level, conference dominated by this. The discontent isn't just from the left of the PLP, it's from moderates, true. Will be on a bigger scale than welfare and could prove fatal, also true. Lord Mandelson, if those events unfolded, it would certainly convince the public that we are unfit for government. What does, by the way, this is really a big deal. This is all correct. You know, resistance to what Israel was doing by ordinary people created this level of crisis within the party of government in this country, which is extraordinary. We'll return to that in a moment. I'll ask you about that in a minute, Kieran. What does the PLP think would follow from announcing recognition? We're streeting. Nothing in practice, but the symbolism matters against the backdrop of what we're seeing. Lord Mandelson got it. So you've got Streeting's messages that seem to pitch him to the left of Starmer's government, while also stating a much clearer moral message on Gaza. No doubt he'll be hoping that does him some favours with his constituency. But the cabinet hasn't taken Streeting's intervention very well. At number 10 was last night briefing that Streeting was engaged in a coup against Starmer. And according to Guido Fawkes, some in number 10 were encouraging the PM to sack the health secretary. One number 10 insider told the Daily Telegraph this. Today's events were so clearly manipulated and coordinated by the West Streeting campaign, but they catastrophically failed when he bottled it by not resigning too. He doesn't have the kind of support he thinks he does, and today proves it, not least because of his very close and long-standing relationship with Peter Mandelson. That's pretty concerning if you're West Streeting, that somebody inside number 10 is already briefing that you're closely associated with Peter Mandelson, which of course he is. Now, going back to Streeting's article, here's what he says about his relationship with Mandelson. Contrary to what has been widely reported, I was not a close friend of Peter Mandelson, but I'm not going to wash my hands of my actual association with him either. Mandelson and I saw each other for dinner on average once a year in a group setting. He offered advice. By the way, it's quite a lot when you're a busy person. He offered advice. There's some friends I haven't seen for more than a year. My partner worked for him 25 years ago and therefore got to know him better than others of that generation in politics, a generation I've always admired since I joined the Labour Party as a 15-year-old in 1998. Now, you'll forgive me if I don't believe any of this. Please forgive me. I'm not saying Streeting is lying. It may well be true that he and Mandelson only met once a year for dinner. I think I've been for dinner with the best man at my wedding once in the last 2 years. But I don't think you, as a cabinet minister, write the kind of confessional and potentially incendiary messages about your own prime minister to Peter Mandelson, a man known to be the master of dark arts without a high level of trust. And we also know that Mandelson was very keen on Streeting becoming Prime Minister. A year ago, Patrick Maguire and Gabriel Pogrund published a long read in the Times about how Streeting was being groomed for leadership of the opposition during Keir Starmer's 2022 Big 8 drama. In the article, they report this following a negative reaction to Streeting's leadership manoeuvring from the rest of the Labour shadow cabinet. As Streeting complained to friends that he was more talked about than talked to, Peter Mandelson allegedly took it upon himself to canvass the shadow cabinet. One of its members recalled the Prince of Darkness making the case for Wes, declaring over the phone, quote, "He's brave, he's great on the media, he's got the ideas." What ideas? She rejected the entreaty out of hand, blending the menace and theatricality for which he was famed. Mandelson is said to have deadpanned, "You're a very cruel woman." He would later insist the conversation had not happened. Liquid Peter Mandelson. Presumably, most people aren't working to get someone into the Labour Party's top job without knowing them pretty well. And that ambition that Mandelson appears to have had for Streeting seems to occur again in the messages Streeting has just revealed. This is Mandelson's last message to Streeting after his sacking as ambassador, one that Streeting appears not to have replied to. Lord Mandelson, shared with you by a Times subscriber, enjoy this article for free. Who is Rob Jetton, the Liberal vying to be the youngest Dutch PM? Like Wes Streeting, Rob Jetton is a young gay man and leader of the Liberal Democrats' 66 party in the Netherlands. In late 2025, Jetton's party narrowly won the Dutch election, with Jetton set to become the first gay prime minister in the country over the coming weeks. I love that. They're tight. They send messages to one another to the extent that Mandelson is sending him messages after being richly humiliated and defenestrated in full public view, and Streeting just doesn't reply. There's a few things that I want to talk about here. Streeting is saying there's no growth strategy, which is the line that's going to be picked up by most of the media, by opposition politicians over the coming months. They're going to say, you've got no growth strategy. Your own health secretary thinks that. So I want to talk about that. I also want to talk about the fact that, we've heard for years now, the protests aren't doing anything. Why are you protesting? Why every week? Why the campaigns? Why BDS? Why are you giving such a hard time to Labour MPs? Literally, there's your reason why. Because MPs in private are saying, look, I've got to recognise Palestine. I'm out of a job, pal. Which is true, by the way. He's out of a job. Probably is anyway. Maybe we pick up on that second point, because I think this is something very close to your heart.
Yeah. I mean, it confirms two things. First of all, as you say, Aaron, that the pro-Palestine movement has grown to such a degree over the past 15, 20 years, particularly since October 7th and the beginning of the all-out genocide in Gaza, has grown to such a degree that it really does eat away at politicians behind closed doors. And however much that might be invisible or invisibilized by the formal rhetoric of power, by the impression that the Israel lobby wants to give to us, by needling prime ministers and their closest courtiers and their outriders in the media, there are very, very serious, tangible, material gains that have been made by the pro-Palestine movement in this country and elsewhere over the past 2 years particularly, but 15, 20 years if you want to take the longer view. That's a really significant thing. And it comes at a moment, I think, when unfortunately, because of the nature of the news cycle, mainstream media news cycle, legacy media news cycle, fewer and fewer people are being reminded day after day about Palestine. And of course, Gaza has been turned into such a desolate wasteland that it is easy for people to feel completely hopeless. It's easy for people to switch off and think, well, nothing we did saved a single hair on a single person's head. That's fair enough. That's a reasonable thing to think when you look at the, as I say, desolate wasteland of Gaza. But this shows that actually we are closer than we think to influencing government policy. And it's consistent with what I've said many times on this show, which is that the reason the Israel lobby exists to the extent that it does now is because of the failing of former Israeli propaganda, which worked without the muscle, which convinced the world that Israel was good and righteous and romantic and idealistic, and they didn't need to use the beefed up Israel lobby to break people's thumbs, metaphorically, behind closed doors to get to say certain things. This shows that we are advancing, that we're working, and that should be something that everybody takes to heart. The second thing I would say is that it shows that Wes Streeting, unequivocally, it shows that Wes Streeting put his own career ahead of his principles. And of course, I know he leaked all of this, rather published it, not leaked it, openly published it, to make himself look good, to try and save his prospects as a future prime minister, which is obviously what you don't need to be a political analyst, though, that's what he was trying to do. But of course, implicit in those messages is that he knew, like you said, they're telling the truth in those messages. They're telling the truth. But they're not saying it publicly, they're saying it in a private message exchange. And so what it does is it actually exposes the cynicism of Wes Streeting, because it shows that what he's trying to do is save his career publicly. He's trying to save his career by releasing messages which privately show that he knows that what Israel is doing are war crimes, heaped upon war crimes, but publicly is helping Israel whitewash a genocide. I mean, that is, make no mistake, that's what Wes Streeting has done.
But also Mandelson recognises what's going on, right? But he then says, well, recognition won't help with the two-state solution. But he recognises fundamentally that there are war crimes, and basically there's an entire nation being killed here. And we can talk about maybe Streeting is so calculating and whatnot that he's published messages that he thought he might have to publish. They were in his back pocket. He wrote this at the time in order to sort of manipulate certain audiences as an insurance policy, maybe. But Mandelson wasn't doing that. And Mandelson, that's the crazy thing. Mandelson's basically like, yeah, it's war crimes. But, we shouldn't adopt that strategy because it doesn't make any difference.
Really briefly, Aaron, on that, what Mandelson is saying is totally consistent with the Blairite line in the early 2000s, middle 2000s. It's really remarkable reading that stuff. He hasn't moved on from the Blair view of a two-state solution. And it's actually quite interesting to see that. Actually, I would have guessed, and I'd be wrong about this, that behind closed doors and trusted parties, Peter Mandelson speaks the language of total realpolitik when it comes to Israel. But actually, in a way, it's worse than that. He is stuck in the middle 2000s with exactly the kind of jargon and rhetoric that Blair's government repeated over and over again in regards to the two-state solution.
We just need a moderate person in charge of the Palestinian Authority and the two-state solution, and work together and stop the death spiral. Liberals have been talking about a two-state solution since Oslo, since the early 1990s, precisely so they don't actually have to talk about the reality of the situation. We all want a two-state solution. No, you don't. Your actions and your words aren't aligned because you're using that in order to not do something quite concrete when tens of thousands of people, maybe far more than that, are being killed, when 16,000 kids are being killed, when a small strip of land, tiny strip of land, is being pounded with more munitions than London, Hamburg, and I think Berlin combined over the whole of the Second World War, one tiny strip of land. We have to have a two-state solution. There's a political impetus for saying that. It's to not talk about this other ginormous thing, which Streeting says out loud. Quickly on the growth strategy, because I think that's the line that, we're talking about stuff that's relevant today, but that's the line that Telegraph columnists and Kemi Badenoch and Nigel Farage are going to return to for weeks and months and maybe even years.
Yeah. Again, it's true. There is no industrial strategy or growth strategy, but we can not expect one from Prime Minister Wes Streeting either. Wes Streeting, it's impossible to know what he would do in government because he hasn't, as Prime Minister, because he hasn't been Prime Minister. But what we can say is that he has always spoken the language of neoliberalism. He's always talked about the importance of fiscal rules. Now, he would say this is collective responsibility. Of course, I had to. But he's always talked Reeves's language and previous austerity Tory government's language of fiscal rules. He's made that very consistently front and centre in what he's said. Fiscal rules, of course, have massively constrained what Rachel Reeves has allowed herself to invest and to spend on public services and a stimulated growth strategy. He talks about the NHS as a driver of growth rather than just merely a public service. No, nothing wrong with drivers of growth, but when they're public goods, when people start talking like that, it's a short garden path to greater privatisation. It just is, because public goods you're supposed to build in the inevitability that sometimes your public goods and your public services will lose money. They're counter-cyclical. They carry on running.
Well,
and
not just that,
operating when
but
they lose
lots
money.
of people being sick is a great money spinner. You know, if you think of something like OxyContin in the United States,
Right.
that in terms of, you look at GDP stats, having millions of people taking opioids that they don't need to be taking is great for growth. It's not so great for the people that then become opioid addicts. So
Exactly.
crazy mindsets apply to healthcare of all things.
For sure. So yeah, I think that's a huge red flag. A huge red flag for anybody who thinks that price to West Street, I'm sure no Novara listeners or viewers do, would be serious about a Keynesian style or something growth strategy led by government. He's just never ever demonstrated any of the qualities that would reassure someone that that is what he actually wants to do. And again, he's flip-flopped on so many things. I mean, Blair, the guy was 11 years ago was saying that, 12 years ago was saying Tony Blair should have no place anywhere near politics because of the war in Iraq. Now he falls over himself to, invite him back into the fold. So it's impossible to believe him any more than it was possible to believe Keir Starmer.
I think quickly on the growth strategy thing, you've got two options, right? Either it's more state spending. Pretty fair to say that Wes Streeting doesn't favour that. If he does, great. I certainly don't think Peter Mandelson does. Either more state spending, or you're going to have more deregulation. You don't do, reform around workers' rights, North Sea oil, fracking, right? That's the kind of reform growth strategy. I don't agree with it, but it probably is a growth strategy, right, in the short to medium term. I don't agree with it. I think the downsides massively outweigh any advantages, but or you do like Corbynism, McDonaldism. I don't know what their quote growth strategy actually is.